Once again, welcome everyone. I'm Eirene Allen, and I'm the director of the Institute for Classics Education. We're a 501c3 nonprofit in the US, and our mission is to provide free resources and support for teachers and learners of ancient Greek texts. I will put my email and the website into the chat if anyone ever wants to contact me, ask any questions, request any resources. I'll always be happy to help in any way I can. Today, I'm so happy to have Lauren Heilman with me. Many of you who've been to our programs, of course, know Lauren. She is a postgraduate researcher at the University of Birmingham, working on her PhD in classics and ancient history. She earned her Master's of Arts degree from Villanova University in classical studies, and she also holds a BA in French and a BA in English from Bob Jones University. And upon graduation, was awarded Outstanding Graduate of Modern Languages and Literatures, as well as Outstanding Graduate of English Language and Literature. She was spotlighted for her postgraduate comparative French classical research and translation work by Auburn University, and she has varied interests, but her primary research focuses on the intersection of classical and biblical texts, the development of cult symbols in ancient to classical Greek literature, ancient Greek philosophy, and classics reception in the centos of Proba and Eudokia. And I think Lauren is going to get us started, and then I shall jump in as well.
Thank you so much for that, Eirene, and thank you for having me back. I'm very excited to begin this sort of dual presentation, as we will be engaging in dialogue and focusing on the Phaedrus of Plato. So as you know, you've signed up for, hopefully you know if you signed up for this course or this lecture, that we will be focusing on the Phaedrus, which is one of the most beautiful of all of Socratic dialogues, all Platonic dialogues. And as the genre dialogue expresses itself, it is something that is meant to be spoken. It is something that occurs between at least two people. And that too is one of the reasons that I'm very excited to be doing this dual presentation with Eirene on the necessity of dialogue, Phaedrus, and the purpose of education. So just to get us started, as you know, Eirene is our go-to Homerist for all things Homer. And Plato is somebody that really picked up on all these Homeric streams because, as you can see from this quote from Longinus, above all others, Plato, who drew off for his own use 10,000 runnels from the great Homeric spring. And it's very important for those of us who are studying philosophy to recognize the history of oral poetry that existed prior to philosophy coming into being, and how it was both influenced by these prior oral poets, particularly Homer, and how even Plato will style himself off of Homer in various ways, one through the dialogue genre being something that is an imitation of an oral action, but also through Homer itself because of the way that he self-stylizes himself in terms of various Homeric heroes. For instance, in the Apology, when Socrates is giving his final speech before the court in his trial, when he's being condemned to, of course, later drink the hemlock, he sets himself up as an Achilles who is fated to die before his appointed time. And then the Phaedo, the dialogue that expresses Socrates' last day, he's set up as Odysseus, and his death is connected to the return of a ship, and the idea of his sort of second sailing, his going off, his nostos into the afterlife, is set up in a very Odyssean style. So in order to understand the things that we will be exploring in this Platonic dialogue, we first have to set up a lot of Homeric ideas, things that are expressed in the capacious nature of the Greek language, and no one can contextualize that better than Eirene Allen, so she is going to head off this first part looking at the Trojan War and Homer.
Thank you, Lauren. So one of the things that I want to just start with is one of the things that we often hear said about Plato is, or asked of Plato, is what are Plato's doctrines? And in the way that we seek doctrines from Plato, we can seek a poetic equivalent from Homer, which is we want to know what is the true story. What is the true story of the Trojan War? Who is the real hero of the Iliad? We want command of the narrative. We want to be able to trim it down to what happened. And we want to know who are these characters really? And one of the challenges that we have is that the oral tradition and archaeological finds deny us these straightforward answers that we want to be able to respond to. Right. So when we're confronted with these endless variations, how do we figure out what is the truth according to our modern values and our understandings? Well, what we try to do is maybe look at the versions and say, well, which one of these seems like the most credible one based, again, on our own values and understandings. We might decide that, oh, these heroes aren't heroic, or we might decide, well, so-and-so is the real hero of the epic. It's really Hector who's the true hero, or it's Achilles who's the true hero, etc. And when we do this, we overlook the core project of Greek mythology, which isn't to seek truth in the details, right? We're going to figure out which of the details are the real ones and which are the false ones, but to look for the truth in the essence of the story. And whether rendered in epic, in tragedy, or in other verse forms, mythic narratives, what do? They explore the relationship between the gods and heroes who were worshipped in rituals by the ancient Greeks who told their stories. The plots of the Iliad and Odyssey are the journey of the hero's life force through the fulfillment of their mortal cycle and their rebirth into immortality, and their enfolding, they're becoming enfolded into this eternal cosmic web as divine forces that are going to be worshipped. Outside the context of ritual, the myths are stories, but within ritual, they're the mediums for connecting the historical people to this cosmic web that they saw themselves being part of. And the ritual enactment that occurs through the telling of the stories in sacred settings, which become, in that setting, words with wings that leave the barrier of their teeth. This telling is meant to collapse the boundaries of past, present, and future, as well as the boundaries between divine and mortal. And we're going to look at what does that mean in Homer, because Homer is actually giving us a model for how this works. So someone will see a little bit later in Lauren's discussion is Drew Heilman. And what Drew Heilman says of Plato's dialogues is that they're reenactments of reenactments. And epic, similarly, is a reenactment that is going to become part of a reenactment. And again, we're given a model of this in book 9. And here's Phoenix talking to Achilles and trying to prevail on him to rejoin the battle. He says, "So it was in days gone by, we heard songs of the famous deeds of men, of heroes, when some violent anger came over them. Gifts and words of persuasion could set them in motion. I have total recall of just such an act from long ago, not a recent one. As we are all dear to each other, I will tell it to you." And what we have on the right-hand side is, what do these words mean? What are these words in Greek? Songs of famous deeds of men, the ones that I've highlighted in the passage. And they have special meaning, according to Gregory Nagy. They have special meaning in the Greek, and they have ritual meaning. And what Nagy tells us is that the telling of the tale by Phoenix is an activation of epic within epic. The narrator needs to know nothing. He needs to experience nothing. All he has to do is hear the kleos, the song of famous deeds of men, from the goddesses of memory, and then to narrate what he is hearing to those who are listening to him. So if we think about the context of this moment where Phoenix addresses Achilles, at this point, Achilles is holding himself back, and the Achaeans are suffering as a result of his decision. Agamemnon, kind of forced at this point to send an expedition to try to appeal to Achilles, to try to prevail on him to rejoin the fight. And 3 people are sent in our Iliad on this mission: Odysseus, who presents a catalog of gifts that failed to move Achilles, and then Phoenix speaks, and he hopes to convince Achilles through the myth of Meleager, who, like Achilles, removed himself from battle in a rage. And as Patroclus will become the reason for Achilles to return to battle, Meleager's wife, Cleopatra, which is an inversion of Patroclus' name, will eventually be the reason that Meleager rejoins the battle. However, he will join the battle too late. In his case, it's going to be too late to restore the good opinion of the comrades he's abandoned. In Achilles' case, it will be too late to save his dearest companion. This story of Meleager that Phoenix tells isn't consistent with every version of this myth that has survived, but it's true to the occasion, right? For the reasons that we've looked at, right? Meleager and Achilles both are seized by grief and anger. They've both isolated themselves and refused to fight, and their comrades are suffering as a response. And again, Achilles will regret too late that he didn't intervene sooner. But Achilles doesn't interpret the story in the way that Phoenix intends him to, possibly exemplifying the concern that philosophers have about myths that they can mislead us. But it's not a matter of Phoenix being right and Achilles being wrong, or vice versa. Each interprets the myth from his own perspective. They're not coming at it from the same place. Phoenix wants to bring Achilles back into the fold, and Achilles wants to be justified in his anger, and they can both find that in the myth itself. So this perspectival nature of human perception that we see in the myths, that we see the myths actually embodying, it makes them multifaceted to the point of inscrutability from our perspective, and also from their perspective. And another place that we see this is in the duel between Tlepolemus and Sarpedon in Book 12. So Tlepolemus says to Sarpedon, "Heracles was my steadfast-spirited, lion-hearted father, and long ago came here in search of the mares of Laomedon, with no more than 6 ships and a smaller force of men, but he sacked the city of Ilium and made widows of its streets." And then Sarpedon, shortly thereafter, replies and says of Heracles to Tlepolemus, "Heracles did indeed destroy sacred Ilium, but only through the folly of a man, splendid Laomedon, who rewarded his good deeds with words of abuse and refused him the mares, on whose account he had come so far." Now, both of these heroes have a personal connection to Heracles via Zeus. Tlepolemus is the son of Heracles, who is, of course, the son of Zeus, and Sarpedon himself is the son of Zeus. But these two relatives basically are fighting on opposite sides. Tlepolemus is fighting for the Achaeans and Sarpedon for the Trojans, and this impacts how each interprets the same data. Both agree that Heracles sacked Troy in days gone by, but they don't agree on the reason Heracles was able to do so. And so we might ask, well, who's right? How do we decide which version of this story is true? Is it that Heracles was so great and strong, or is it that Laomedon was a fool? And we always want these either or, and we want to pick that one answer. But again, absolute truth is concealed behind this veil of perspective, and possibly, right, most likely, both are true. And there's that duality. We similarly see oppositional interpretations of Helen in the Odyssey. In Book 4, when Odysseus' son Telemachus visits them in Sparta seeking news about his father, they each tell a story about Odysseus, but the stories they tell turn out to be stories about Helen as well as about themselves. And what the story that Helen tells about Odysseus is, so after killing many Trojans with the sharp-bladed bronze, Odysseus rejoined the Argives, taking much information with him. The other Trojan women set up a shrill wail, but my heart was delighted, since it had now shifted to returning to my home again. I looked back with grief on the blind delusion sent me by Aphrodite when she took me away to Troy from my dear homeland, and when I abandoned my daughter and bridal room and husband, who was inferior to no man in either understanding or beauty. And then Menelaus says, yeah, this is all the things that you said were true, Helen. Menelaus says, I also have a story to tell about this mighty, daring man. We were all sitting inside the wooden horse, the best of the Argives, ready to bring death and doom to the Trojans. You approached it, Helen. It was likely that some divinity, and the word in the Greek is daimon, who wished to give glory to the Trojans, directed you. 3 times you circled the hollow ambush, feeling along it with your hands, calling out to the Danaan chieftains, name by name, and imitating the voice of all the Argives' wives. So Helen, in her story, asserts that she assisted Odysseus when he conducted a secret spy mission inside Troy because she regretted having left her homeland and her people. But Menelaus recalls her attempting to lure the Achaeans out of their hiding place in the horse, though, of course, both acknowledge the presence of a superhuman force in this, and that is Aphrodite. So again, the stories that these heroes are telling are both about themselves, but they're also about their audience, because they're telling this story to Telemachus, who wants to know who his father is. So all of these are interacting in these versions of the stories that they're telling. And the one noticeable thing that we can have, again, is this seemingly contradictory motive that Helen has. Does she want to help the Achaeans, or does she want to harm them? And so we often end up asking this question, did Helen go willingly, or was she abducted? And for us, there can only be one answer to that, but maybe not for the Greeks. So maybe not for the Greeks, right? We can look for help to understanding that at this book 3 Iliad scene, where Helen's contradictory motives are whether she wants to help or harm the Achaeans. We get a little vision of that, a little insight into that by looking back at this book 3 scene. And in this scene, Aphrodite has ordered Helen to go to Paris's bed, and Helen initially resists, prompting Aphrodite to threaten to destroy her. And so we have this scene, right? Aphrodite, provoked to anger, addressed her, "Do not provoke me, perverse woman. Don't make me angry and let you go, or I will hate you as terribly as I now love you, and I will devise baneful enmity among the two sides, Trojan and Danaan, and you will perish from evil doom." So she spoke, and Helen, born of Zeus, was afraid. Covering her face with her bright, radiant robe, she walked in silence and escaped the notice of all the Trojan women. A superhuman force, a daemon, led her. So when we look at this book 4 scene, look back at the book 4 scene through the lens of this book 3 scene, Helen could both have resisted the superhuman force by helping Odysseus, and she could also have submitted to that superhuman force by attempting to trick the Achaeans later. The myths record not only divine will and mortal actions, but the interwoven nature of the two. And this is necessarily going to have multiple facets. It's not going to be so straightforward the way that we necessarily want it to be. That duality is always there. So we could also now look at, what does Penelope say about Helen? That's another person who's giving us a story about her. And of course, now we have Penelope telling a story about Helen that's also really about Penelope and also about her audience, Odysseus. And in Odyssey Book 23, Penelope is explaining to Odysseus why she subjected him to this strident testing process. And she says that she was afraid of being led astray by a divine force. And then she says, not even Helen of Argos, born of Zeus, would have mingled in love in the bed of a man from another people if she had known that the sons of the Achaeans, devoted to Ares, intended to lead her back home to her land and her people. Truly a god, a theos, stirred up unseemly acts for her to do. Before then, she did not store up in her consciousness delusion, baneful, from which grief reached us from the start. Now here, it's interesting that speaking of past events that have already passed, that are no longer felt to be a threat to her, Penelope doesn't speak of a daemon, as we saw describing Helen earlier, but a god. And one of the things that Gregory Nagy tells us in this book that we all highly recommend, The Ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours, is that the daemon is used to refer to an unspecified god or hero intervening in human life. The word daemon is to be contrasted with theos, which is used to refer to a specified god. So this differentiation helps us understand that this word daemon is invoked in the moment that wills are actively in contest. And we see several examples of these contests in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, with varying outcomes. Hector and Andromache refer to each other in the vocative as daemony when they confront each other on the walls of Troy in Iliad Book 6, very famous scene, frequently rendered in many different artistic mediums. Odysseus and Penelope also refer to each other, again in the vocative, as daemony when she is conducting her final test of him. And we also hear heroes described as equal to a daemon when they confront gods. And we see that in Iliad Book 6 with Diomedes and Apollo, and Patroclus and Apollo in Iliad Book 16. So these contests of wills end in with a variety of outcomes. We can have the death of the hero, as with Patroclus. We also see heroes submitting to divine will. Diomedes backs off after the third time Apollo warns him. Helen backs off after Aphrodite threatens her. And we also see in Odysseus and Penelope that their wills align for their mutual benefit. So they're in contest, but they're also in contest to come together. Again, there's that wonderful duality we love so much. So in Phaedrus, we do see the diamond invoked in the contest between Socrates and Phaedrus and the dialogue between them. So after Phaedrus recites Lysias' speech for Socrates, he says, well, Socrates, what did you think of this speech? And how did this speech affect you? And Socrates says superhumanly. And the word in Greek again is daimonios. In fact, my friend, enough to make me beside myself. And it was because of you, Phaedrus, that I felt as I did, as I looked at you, because you seemed to me to be positively beaming with delight at the speech as you were reading, for I followed your lead, thinking that you are more of an expert about such things than me. And I joined in the ecstasy of your inspired self. And in the Greek, the literal translation would be something like, I joined in the feast of Bacchus with your divinely inspired lead. So interesting to notice that. And then again, we'll talk about a little more in a minute, but we'll see in another place also as Phaedrus presses Socrates for more on on his reaction. Socrates says, my breast is full, if I may say so. My fine fellow is the translation, but the Greek word again is daimoni. And I see that I would have other things to say beyond what Lysias says, and no worse either. I am well aware that I have thought up none of them from within my resources, because I am conscious of my own ignorance. The only alternative then, I think, is that I have been filled up through my ears like a vessel from someone else's streams. So a few noteworthy things here. Socrates attributes the success of the speech not to the words that were written down, not to the words from the papyrus or what have you, whatever it is that Lysias is reading from, but to Phaedrus's performance of them. It's the winged words that have the impact. And Phaedrus, in the beginning, didn't want to admit that he had a written copy of the speech, but Socrates ultimately compelled him or prevailed on him to perform the speech. And Socrates is likening the effect of the performance to a sacred event, right? The Bacchic feast that obliterates, because this is what the rituals do, these boundaries between what is within Socrates and what is outside of him. And interesting also to note that the daimony seems to be leading Socrates in a direction he doesn't necessarily want to go. So all of these Homeric illusions are sort of bubbling through the words and the surface. And this collapsing of boundaries, whether between internal and external, divine and mortal, familiar and strange, they're expressed in the context of a thauma, a marvel, or the act of marveling, which we see in both Homer and Plato. And Jessica Lightfoot, in her Wonder and the Marvelous from Homer to the Hellenistic World, gives us this exploration of the divine presence as mover and how it's connected to the concept of thauma or marvel. And one of the most sort of precise places that we can see it is in this moment where Hephaestus's automata and tripods are described in Iliad book 18. And this is when Thetis comes to request that he craft armor for Achilles. And Thetis found him bustling about, sweating and busying himself with his bellows, for he was forging tripods, 20 in all, that were to stand around the wall of his well-built hall. Under the base of each one had fixed wheels of gold, so that of their own accord they would enter the gods' assembly and then return again to his house. A wonder, a thauma to look upon. And what Lightfoot has here is these self-moving tripods become the archetypal examples of automata in the Greek literary tradition, along with similarly lifelike moving golden handmaidens, also made by Hephaestus, which aid the god in his work. The particular connection of these objects to the god's craft is important. Once again, we see that early conceptions of the marvelous are linked explicitly to the power of the divine. And this is the key concept, that Hephaestus's automata described as a wonder underscore the divine hand in the presence of this act of marveling. And the tripods and the golden maidens appear to be moving independently, but they're actually animated by Hephaestus. Right? They're not moving, they're not self-moving, they're Hephaestus moving. They're God moved. And again, we can see the divine hand in one of the most memorable and I think moving passages ever to be written down. And that is when Priam comes to Achilles as a suppliant to present a ransom for the body of Hector, his son, who Achilles killed to avenge Hector's killing of Patroclus, right? So we see this chain of vengeance that's going round and round and with no end in sight. But now here comes Priam. And great Priam entered undetected by the two men and stood close to Achilles and took his knees in his arms and kissed the terrible manslaughtering hands that had killed so many of his sons. As when delusion takes tight hold of someone who has killed a man in his own country, and he comes to another people, to the house of a rich man, and amazement seizes the onlookers, so Achilles was amazed, Thaumasdein, when he saw godlike Priam, and the others too were amazed and looked at one another. So the gods had collectively agreed that the body of Hector had to be returned to his father, and Hermes was sent to lead Priam safely to Achilles' feet. So concealed by Hermes, Priam appears in Achilles' tent without warning, provoking him and his companions to be, again, amazed at his sudden appearance. So it seems that this is a scene between Priam and Achilles, but the gods themselves are implicitly present in this scene, not only by their sanction, but by the fact that Priam has been delivered to this place, to this spot, undetected by Priam. And after lifting Achilles' hand to his mouth, Priam asks him to think of his own father, who will, like Priam, grieve his son's death, and to consider that Priam is even more worthy of pity, since he has kissed the hand that killed his son. And these words provoke Achilles to weep for his father. And the boundaries between them, right? These man-made boundaries, friend and enemy, collapse in this moment. And Priam isn't just the father of Achilles' enemy, but he's the father who's grieving his son's death, as Achilles' father will grieve his death. And Achilles isn't just the man who killed his son, but also a son who'll be grieved by his father as Priam is grieving. So by becoming the duality, by adopting the perspective of the other and becoming the duality, again, the men become integrated with the divine and with each other, and all of the things that would separate them, all the boundaries that would separate them, collapse in that moment. And so it's a perfect ritual moment of being united with the divine and united with each other. At the beginning of the Phaedrus described Socrates as a thaumasie, he calls him, a marvel. You, my friend, really appear the most extraordinary sort of person. You behave like someone being led around a strange place, as you say, and not like a local. It comes of you not leaving the city to cross the border, or even, it seems to me, to go outside the wall at all. And the provocation for Phaedrus's exclamation here, right, is that Socrates, though a native, appears to be atopos, right, out of place in this natural setting. And though Socrates replies that he considers himself a man of the city and he associates the city with dialogues and learning with other men, this sense of wonder that's provoked by the place that they're in is what sparks the philosophical inquiry. And as Lauren will discuss, the gods of the place become enfolded in this inquiry. And so, yeah, I'll leave it there and let Lauren work that part out. Yeah, but the sense of wonder holds the duality. It can be ambivalent, however, and this is something that Jessica Lightfoot also beautifully articulates. Not only is Thelma consistently conceived of as an emotional reaction to the recognition that what was initially perceived to be radically other is in some sense uncannily familiar, and vice versa. It is also seen as a sort of catalyst which kickstarts the cognitive processes of realization and learning, which potentially ensue as a result of this recognition. And again, we can see all these familiar themes of collapsing of boundaries and integration and duality. She also notes that in Plato's laws, there's the suggestion that humans, like automata, are similarly created by the gods, and that each person has the capability, if set moving in the right direction, to become an object of wonder. While in the allegory of the cave, Thaumaata represent a dangerous distraction from cognitive advancements when their powers of astonishment are wielded in the wrong hands. And in Socrates, at the end of the dialogue, Socrates offers his final prayer to the gods of the deities. And he says, "Dear Pan and all you gods of this place, grant me that I may become beautiful within, and that what is in my possession outside of me may be in friendly accord with what is inside." So here again, there's a hope, actually a hope for the boundaries to collapse and for his own divine essence, for his own daimon to be integrated into the divine whole. And then we have Drew Heilman explaining why Plato wrote dialogues. To be wise is to be a god, which is from Symposium. And Heilman says, the philosopher is thus in the classic tragic situation, striving to overcome a fate which has already been decided in advance and thus bound to fail, but fail in a way that ennobles him. And I think Lauren now will pick up on, take this dialogue further into Phaedrus.
Thank you so much, Eirene. It's positively beautiful contextualization, and I really love each of the elements that you brought out there. And like you said, they are so present in Plato, the concept of the daimon, the concept of the word, the winged word being the thing that is important, and also this marveling aspect, the convergence of the divine and the mortal in every moment here. So just to continue with this Heilman, which is an article that we're both incredibly fond of, an article called Why Plato Wrote Dialogues. This is a quote from it, and those of you that are in the philosophy course this semester will have already seen it and been familiar with it, but it explains why Plato chose the dialogue as a genre. And part of it is because he's not directly giving you his doctrinal version of what his philosophy is. Rather, he's inviting you in a philosophic symbiotic creation. As you'll see here, it says these dialogues are imitations of philosophic situations, of what it would be like to philosophize. Indeed, those dialogues, which are secondhand accounts, e.g. the Parmenides, Symposium, Theaetetus, are as imitations of what went on at the meeting, imitations of imitations, or art in precisely the way in which is characterized in the Republic. The point is, as imitations of philosophy, they are not philosophy, the reality itself. This is why Plato can say truthfully that he has never written his philosophy. But like the best works of art, these imitations may lead the beholder to reality itself. The image of philosophy, which is presented in the dialogues, may lead us to be philosophers. Thus, and as we saw earlier, the dialogues function both as imitations of and as invitations to philosophy. And that's what I hope you enjoy if you are reading a Platonic dialogue at the moment, or if you return to the Phaedrus at some point after this, is to recognize the fact that neither Plato nor Socrates is creating a specific doctrine, but this imitation of a philosophic dialogue, this pursuit of inquiry in the way that words are interwoven, is designed to invite you to participate in the same experience, to take on that same role of inquirer, which is what it is to be a philosopher, not to have an absolute understanding of knowledge, but to be in this posture of inquiry throughout your life. And that emphasis is, of course, always on the oral word for Plato and for Socrates. So just to set this up and understand why this is so important that we understand the setting of the Phaedrus and how this ties into things that we see with Plato. First of all, just as a reminder to ourselves, Plato was born in 427 BC, and he was a student of Socrates. And we think of him very strongly in the connection to founding the Academy in Athens, which lasted all the way up until AD 529. So he had quite a lasting impact on philosophy, not just through his written dialogues, but through the teaching or the inquiry that was pursued there at the Academy. We'll talk about that in a second. And like Socrates, as we just saw in the Heilman article, he never wrote down his own philosophy. So Socrates left no writings at all, and Plato left dialogues, which we've just seen are rather simulations of dialogue, simulations of philosophy, and invitations for you to pursue it. You're not meant to go to a dialogue and say, this is absolutely what Plato believed, this is absolutely what Socrates believed at any point. You can't pick a line and say this was their doctrine, but rather you're invited to follow along in this pursuit. And it's more a training of ways of thinking than it is telling you what to think. It's guiding you in a process to greater inquiry into a posture of looking up at the divine, as we often see by the end of just about every Platonic dialogue. It ends with a nice either little myth or with some story that sort of ties everything together, pushing us upwards, looking up at the things that are greater, the things that are beyond just what we see every day. So the way education at the academy worked, and the reason I'm focusing on this is because we're talking about the Phaedrus as a dialogue, the importance of dialogue to the purpose of education. We're not creating a systematic structure of how we organize this school. For the academy, what's happening at the academy, they wouldn't have, say, prereq classes or core classes, or you have to pass this class and take this test. No, it was actually designed in such a way where you would have what we might call a lecture. What we might call a lecturer or somebody that is speaking, say Plato, and he will be posing questions to students, and they in turn will be posing questions, and they will be following a dialogue or a line of inquiry, the same as we see in these dialogues that are written down. So it was more discussion based. So there was the Socratic questioning would lead to a development of the mind. And this is important because it allows for revision in the future without binding it to anything that's too fixed or dogmatic answer. We say this is the one and only true thing. No, we're constantly being able to look forward. And that's why Aristotle, even though he was somebody from the academy, his views can be both parallel with and still divergent from the things that we see in Plato, because he's following these lines of inquiry. So coming to our dialogue of the day, Phaedrus, I like to look at the importance of beginning words in every dialogue, because always it's so brilliantly structured, it's so brilliantly set forth that the beginning of every dialogue has a line that will sort of give us a directional idea of where the rest of the dialogue is going. So in the Phaedrus, it's "O phile Phaedre," which is like, my dear Phaedrus, where are you going? And where is it you're going? And where have you come from? Or I like to say it in slightly archaic English, whither and whence. We have this directional thing. Where have you come from? Where are you going? So we're going to be checking out, and we'll see by the way it ends, that the sort of comes full circle, the directions that they are pursuing in their inquiry and how they're going to carry on together, no longer as separate individuals, but in a dual sort of symbiotic fashion. And this, just to give some other examples from other Platonic dialogues, for those of you familiar with the Republic, that's very famously begins with the word kateben, I went down. So Socrates says, yesterday I went down to Piraeus, and that opening with kateben, many scholars have seen that as being tied to the catabasis of Odysseus, where he went down into the underworld to find out about the fates of himself and his friends. So the whole journey of the Republic is kind of like a descent and a return to light and life by the end. And of course, one of the prominent images in the Republic is that of the cave, where just such a descent and ascent is pictured for us. In Phaedo, we have the question of who was present at Socrates' death, and autos, like self. Were you there present yourself, Phaedo, at this last day of Socrates? And we get this lovely little detail that Plato himself was not present there, which kind of gives him free rein in how he writes this dialogue, that he is, like we've already seen with Heilman, creating an imitation of a dialogue, an imitation of what went on, a simulation of these ideas, but not giving you a verbatim account of what went on, because that's not necessarily as productive. So the beginning of this dialogue, the Phaedrus, whither and whence, it opens by questioning direction. And so your reader, and I put reader in quotes, but the person listening to this dialogue, the person participating in this dialogue, is invited to sort of question the direction of many of the topics in the dialogue. And what we'll see those questions being, they have to do with memory, they have to do with writing versus orality, and some other things that we'll see along the way. Now, just to set this up, like I said, every dialogue has a specific opening line or specific opening words and specific setting that gets tied into the ritual. So just as we've already seen with Eirene and her section of the presentation, that in Homer, every myth gets almost re-performed, reenacted in ritual. The same thing happens in these dialogues as they're sort of based out of this Homeric setting. So what happens with the Phaedrus, we immediately see that the setting is they're outside of Athens. They're in this nature setting, and we get these details that there is a plane tree, which is going to be very, very important, a river, a chaste tree, and all of these things are going to tie into what a particular ritual that previously existed, and it will be tied into a sacred space connected to the gods. So as you can see here, one of the passages I pull says, no, I shall say it, and what I saw will be an oath I swear to you. By whom? By which God? What about this plane tree here? I swear to you in the presence of this plane tree, I shall neither display nor report to you any speech of anyone's ever again. So this is where Phaedrus, whom, as we've already hinted at in Eirene's presentation, he had become out walking. He just heard this wonderful speech of Lysias that he thought was particularly marvelous, and he had a written copy of it concealed. And then he ends up, upon compulsion, presenting it to Socrates, who does find some fault with it. And Socrates could produce his own speech extempore, which he will do, but he refuses to in the beginning. So Phaedrus says, no, I'm going to persuade you to do this. And I swear to you, and I'm going to swear on a divinity. And what do I have here? I have beside me this plane tree. So he acknowledges that this plane tree specifically is a divinity or a specific God. And he said, I'll swear unto you that if you don't give me the speech now, I'll never show you any other speech again. We'll never have a conversation like this again. And so, of course, Socrates has to do it. But the reason I'm pulling this part to you right now is because I want to show that the plane tree is very significant and it will be invoked throughout the dialogue. And that is something that we will look at too in a moment. And also Socrates says, I myself, Phaedrus, blame the gods of the place, and perhaps too the spokesmen of the muses who sing over our heads may have breathed this gift upon us. So the sacred setting that they are in contains divinities. There are several references throughout the dialogue to divinities present in this location. And Socrates sees himself, again, this dual nature converging with the will of the mortals and the will of the immortals in one speech, or in a set of speeches, as we'll soon see. But this setting also has been connected by some scholars to the setting of the academy itself, because the academy was known for the trees that it had around it. This is a sort of arboreal setting, is meant to evoke not just the dialogue that takes place imaginatively between Socrates and Phaedrus, but ideas for the types of conversations that would have gone on in the gardens of the academy itself, which might have happened in Plato. So like I said, Phaedrus has with him a speech of Lysias, which he greatly admires and which he shares with Socrates. And the speech, in what Phaedrus supposes is splendid rhetoric, will tell why a person should bestow romantic favor on someone who is not in love with him rather than on someone who is in love with him. And what follows is Socrates' own impromptu opposing speech, ushered on by Phaedrus, as we're seeing here, on why one should choose the lover instead of the non-lover. And this will all be happening in this sacred location. So as we see, Socrates will say, I am conscious of my own ignorance. The only alternative then, I think, is that I have been filled up through my ears like a vessel from someone else's streams. And also he says, well then, my dear Phaedrus, do you know, I'm trying to move this, do you, my dear Phaedrus, do you think as I do myself that something more than human has happened to me here as he's speaking, as he begins to deliver his speech? And Phaedrus says, I certainly agree, Socrates, that you've been seized by a fluency greater than normal. He says, then listen to me in silence, for the spot seems really to be a divine one. So if by any chance I become possessed by the nymphs as my speech proceeds, don't be surprised. As it is, I'm already close to uttering dithyrambics. So the idea that he's almost verging into verse in his prose, that he's sort of going into this spiritual speech, is meant to be inspired by the sacred location and again the convergence of the divine and mortal wills in this moment. So like I said, there had been a written speech that Phaedrus proposed that was made by a man named Lysias, and it was on behalf of why you should accept the favors of someone who isn't in love with you as opposed to someone who is. So Socrates' first speech that he gives, he's going to cover his head when he performs this speech, and I do mean perform because it takes on this sort of ritual performance aspect, as scholars have noted. He'll cover his head with the cloak and he'll make this speech on behalf of why you should accept the lover rather than the non-lover. And in doing so, he suggests that it's actually the character of the person will be enhanced as this occurs. So just as Homer already has presented a dual reality, even as we saw in Eirene's section on in the person of Helen, so the Platonic dialogues will reflect the varying myths that are surrounding her. And this is something that's going to occur in this speech. Because as you notice, first of all, we have on the one hand, he makes a speech on behalf of the lover, and then he's going to actually have to stop and make a second speech and atone for the words that he spoke against the god of love, whom he thought had a negative portrayal in the previous speeches. Now, this all connects to somebody named Stesichorus and an ode that he made against Helen, and then a palinode that he made on behalf of Helen. So the two speeches speeches that Socrates makes, one first on behalf of the lover, but somewhat maligning the god of love, he thinks. And then the second one that he makes to atone for his words spoken against the god of love, he will perform in such a way that they will mimic what we see with Stesichorus and what he wrote about Helen. So like I was saying, in Homer, we first of all have a dual reality in the person of Helen, and then these Platonic dialogues reflect the varying myths that surrounded her. So just to review what we know about Helen, first of all, in both Euripides' play Helen, as well as in Herodotus' histories, they record versions in which Helen was in no way culpable for the Trojan War, but was rather whisked away to Egypt while the Achaeans fought to retrieve a phantom version of her. So this responds to the idea that we've already seen in Eirene, the question of did she go willingly or was she abducted? In the Homeric version, we would say that there was a convergence of divine and mortal wills. In later periods, there was an emphasis to try to get rid of any guilt associated with Helen, and there was this alternate myth that she had never gone to Troy at all, that she had been whisked away to Egypt, and then all of the Achaeans were just fighting a war over her phantom. So in this way, she was whisked away to Egypt while the Achaeans fought to retrieve a phantom version of her. Now, the lyric poet Stesichorus had written an ode maligning Helen for her role in the Trojan War, but was supposedly struck blind in punishment, only receiving his sight again in conjunction to his writing a palinode to counteract his first ode, now expunging Helen of all guilt. It is to this incident that Plato is believed to allude in Socrates' two speeches that we see here. So after making his first speech, Socrates receives a divine sign, and we learn that this is from his daimon. So that supernatural spiritual force, that guiding spirit that we see that crops up in Platonic dialogues as well as in Homer, actually gives Socrates a sign that he cannot go further until he has made his palinode here, rather like Stesichorus. So a divine sign from his daimon, and that prohibits him from continuing on his way until he makes propitiation. Now, according to a scholar by the name of Capra, both of these speeches, both the first speech and the second speech, the seeming ode and palinode, are inspired, despite the fact that the second one is designed to atone for the first. And this reminds us of the duality that is ever present in the divine and of Socrates' own warning in the Phaedrus not to waste time searching for rationalistic explanations of the divine myths, but rather to allow that duality to exist in an unadulterated state. So by performing the first speech with his cloaked head, this is contrasted with the bareheaded palinode afterwards, because he decides to make this second one with his head uncovered, he says, for shame. But that has been seen as being emblematic of his Stesichorus blindness and then return to sight. So just as Stesichorus wrote an ode maligning Helen, and then an ode, a palinode, obliterating Helen of all guilt, and he had the blindness in between, so scholars have identified these two Socratic speeches of Socrates here, the one with his head covered and the one with his head bared, as being sort of a performative ritual in which Stesichorus is invoked, because Stesichorus and Helen both get mentioned in this dialogue, and it's done in such a way that it seemed like he's covered as if blind, and then the return to sight, that his head is uncovered. And as I've said, that Helen is so present in this dialogue, it's not just through the references to Stesichorus and the ode and palinodes that we see in Socrates' speeches, but this also will continue throughout as we see again the plane tree cult being reinvigorated further on throughout the dialogue. But just to back up what I've previously said here, Andrea Capra actually wrote in this book, Plato's Four Muses, which I highly recommend, discussing the Stesichorus element. He says, thus the beginning of an impious speech features, among other things, Socrates covering his head and his no less curious invocation to the muses. On the subjects of this curious head covering, Marian Demos makes the important point that the legend that Stesichorus lost his sight because of his defamation of Helen is analogous to Socrates' lack of vision during the speech he delivers with his head covered. Immediately before delivering his palinode, which is intended as an apotropaic gesture, Socrates uncovers his head. When in reality he regains his vision at this part of the speech, he simultaneously regains his figurative sight into the true nature of love. This makes perfect sense provided we replace legend with performance. Socrates' delivery of his two speeches is clearly analogous to Stesichorus' performance, and Socrates, it may be added, goes so far as to ask Phaedrus for directions, as if he were a blind man, with the line, "Where is my boy, the one that I was talking to?" So by this imitation, which is something that can be so easily lost in modern translations, if we're not familiar with the poets, the lyric poets that he's alluding to, such as Stesichorus, the myths surrounding Helen, we get to lose a lot of this very important ritual significance that Socrates is both invoking and reenacting in a performance context within this dialogue. So we really have a convergence of all sort of Homeric ideals placed in one moment as a ritual is being reenacted here. So continuing on with what I said about Helen and Helen being invoked, of course, these odes are connected in some way to Stesichorus's poems for and against Helen, but also we see here, according to Nicole Leroux, Helen haunts Socrates' second speech, and Capra identifies her presence with the plane tree by which Phaedrus swears. Now, Helen, we know, was worshipped both as a hero and a goddess in a variety of cults, but the plane tree was among the most prominent symbols associated with her. And you can see on the right too, according to Pausanias and Rhodes, Helen was worshipped as a tree goddess known as dendritis, and that was done by first hanging an image of her on the tree and then having a ritual to worship it. Now, pulling from that Capra book you see here on the left, he says, first quoting Phaedrus, "Now I shall say it, and it'll be an oath I swear to you but by whom among the gods? What about this plane tree here?" This is the passage we've already looked at, swearing by the plane tree. "I swear that if you don't make your speech in her very presence, I shan't display or report to you any speech of anyone's ever again." And he notes that the plane tree is referred to surprisingly as a divinity. Now, in Greek terms, the quasi-personification of the plane tree can only be read as an instance of the very common idea that trees, which are always feminine in Greek, stand for or are the embodiment of divine creatures. So as Capra continues to say in this passage, says whether Helen is considered as a goddess because she was worshipped in some cults as a goddess, others she was worshipped as a hero. There were hero cults connecting her to Menelaus as well. Or if we even see her as a pre-Greek arboreal divinity, like this sort of Helen worship that we find in Rhodes, or something else, again, it's still quite clear that plane trees could stand for Helen, or even as Karl Bütticher bluntly put it, that the name of Helen and that of the plane tree could be interchangeable. But as we've seen in the Odyssey already, Helen can be associated with a variety of memories, including the act of recalling memory itself, as she provides a drug, or what is called in the Greek a pharmakon, in Book 4 to dull painful emotions. This is what she does before she invokes those two contrasting stories about Odysseus that we saw with Helen and Menelaus in Eirene's presentation, that she first gives a drug to dull any emotions so that people would not be able to cry. Even if they saw a family member slaughtered in front of them, they wouldn't be able to cry. So it suppresses an emotion and allows for the emergence of memories that might otherwise be painful. So she does this by a drug called pharmakon in the Odyssey. Now, within the Phaedrus, Socrates specifically tells Phaedrus that he found a good pharmakon, or drug, to pull him outside of the city walls. In other words, this whole dialogue and this discussion of speech writing, etc., is considered to be a pharmakon, or a drug, and it pulls Socrates out of Athens to have this discussion in this sacred place. And it is to be noted also that this word carries a dual meaning, because it can have either positive or negative connotations, as it can be medicinal, so a drug that would help you recover from an illness, or in the case of Socrates' drug in the Phaedo, in the day that he dies, the hemlock, it can also be, of course, fatal. So this pharmakon here that is sort of ushering in these memories, it has that dual function that we've already seen. It could be positive, it could be negative, but it also was connected to the role of summoning back memory. So all these things are ideas that sort of get teased out in Socrates' second speech as he's making his palinode, as he's going back and speaking on behalf of the god of love, and he will address the role of memory specifically, as we've seen it used with Helen, in this next section. And he does so as he begins to talk about the journey of the soul. So it's from this palinode, which is rich in Helen-centric imagery, that Socrates elaborates on the role of memory and reminding, even of the Platonic idea of forms, which of course is a pet topic in many Platonic dialogues, the idea that what you see here is a shadow of a divine form that you've seen in your pre-incarnate state. So Helen is associated with a variety of memories, but even love, the subject of this speech, connects to memory itself. So Socrates describes the journey of the soul in its in-between state. So in between reincarnation's moments, or in your pre-incarnate state, you would have, your pre-incarnate self would have seen a procession of the gods. And this sort of reminds us of the language we saw in part of Eirene's presentation, where we saw him talking about Phaedrus, I followed you, as if in the Bacchic procession, as if in this Bacchic feast. That idea of a procession here gets imitated. So Socrates describes the journey of the soul in its in-between state as viewing a procession of the gods, but then coming into your human form, not all of it and not everybody would have retained an equal memory of it. Some people would have remembered more, some people would have remembered less. And this is an idea that gets picked up in the Republic, in the myth of the idea that what was seen there in that intermediate state before you entered your next cycle of reincarnation, depending on how much of the river of Lethe people might have drunk, they would have either remembered more and retained wisdom in the next life, or remembered less and sort of gone through in just a naturalistic state. So consequently, when confronted with a vision of beauty on earth, and this is what it ties into the role of love, since all the speeches have to do with whether we are accepting or rejecting the favors of a person in a romantic sense. When you see someone attractive, when you see a vision of beauty on earth, some are merely attracted to the physical nature of that beauty, and some recall from it the greatest beauty which they saw when they were viewing the procession of the gods. So for those who remember, earthly beauty contains an even greater significance, and then memory and recall both become conduits between the mortal realm and the divine. So to look at the passage as it's seen here, he says, well, then, this is the outcome of my whole account of the fourth kind of madness, because he begins to talk about the various divine madnesses connected to love and connected to the different divinities, Apollo, so forth, that one can undergo, and love itself being a kind of madness, but a divine one. So he says, the madness of the man who, on seeing beauty here on earth and being reminded of true beauty, that is, you see the attractive person, you remember this form of the gods that you saw in the procession, becomes winged and fluttering with eagerness to fly upwards, but he's unable to leave the ground, looking upwards like a bird and taking no heed of things below. And that causes him to be regarded as mad. The outcome is that this, in fact, reveals itself as the best of all kinds of divine possession, and from the best of sources for the man who is subject to it and shares in it, and that when he partakes in this madness, that the man who loves the beautiful is called a lover. So here he shows, as we've already seen, that this is an element of possession, and that it's done in connection to a memory of the divine. So by seeing that image of beauty on earth, reminding it of something higher, even though you're still trapped in your mortal body, you can't fly up swan-like, still you're having that connection. And because you have that memory of the divine, you get regarded on earth as mad. And that reminds us of what we've seen in the Homeric epics too, of how something gets seemingly associated as being self-moving, but in reality it is divinely animated here. So from this point, moving on, following this train of an understanding of memory will lead to a discussion of speech writing itself. So it seems to kind of change directions, but really it's following the same theme in this dialogue. Leads to a discussion of speech writing itself and an understanding of Plato's choice to write dialogues. Now, as we've seen, Socrates left no writings. Plato did not truly write his philosophy, but as Heilman stated, imitations of and invitations to philosophy. And here we find the source of this philosophy of writing in the Phaedrus itself. Socrates says that the offspring of painting, so something that's just physical there, stands there as if alive, but if you ask that painting something, preserves quite a solemn silence. And it's the same thing with written words. You might think that they spoke as if they had some thought in their heads, but if you ever ask them about any of the things they say out of a desire to learn, they point to just one thing and the same thing each time. And when once it is written, every composition trundles about everywhere in the same way, in the presence of both those who know about the subject and those who have nothing at all to do about it. And it does not know how to address those it should address and not those it should not. When it is ill-treated and unjustly abused, it always needs its father to help it, for it is incapable of either defending or helping itself. So these writings become fatherless or orphaned. So just as when you're having this dialogue, a discussion, you can always ask the other person, continue to pose questions and get the point of it. Whereas something that you write, you send it out, you publish it, somebody can misinterpret it, somebody can half read it and fall into the wrong hands. Or even if you're an ardent student, you have a question about it, you can't contact the author, perhaps the author's dead, such as the case of Socrates and Plato, and you can't ever get anything further from it. So the writing is considered inferior in that way to the voiced word. And to prove his point, Socrates tells us an Egyptian myth at the very end of the dialogue. And this sort of reminds us again of the presence of Helen throughout, because Helen in her whisked away state was remaining in Egypt for the duration of the Trojan War, as you see particularly in Euripides' Helen. So to prove his point, he will now tell an Egyptian myth in which the technology of writing is not lauded, but relegated to a mere reminder. So as you see here on the left, it says your invention will produce forgetfulness in the souls of those who have learned it through lack of practice at using their memory, as through reliance on writing they are reminded from the outside by alien marks, not from within themselves by themselves. So you have discovered an elixir not of memory, but of reminding. So this was telling the story of how literacy supposedly came to Egypt, and this was the reaction, the idea that what you have created, writing something down, and we can all think about it in our natural lives. If you jot something down on a Post-it note, and then you think, what on earth was I writing about? It's not memory, it's something that will remind you of something else. And if you don't phrase it in the exact same way, you might not remember what that actually is. But memory is something that you conjured up because you have been actively thinking about something and you're able to pull it out of your soul. That is memory. But what you see externally, whether it's a painting or whether it's written words, that's simply reminding you. And of course, the perfect example of reminding and memory working in tandem will be what Socrates calls amnesis. That is, you see the object, you remember from inside the divine thing you saw before, and the two have this convergence here. Now, just to show you that this wasn't merely a Platonic idea, I mean, not to say merely, but that this was actually something that was understood in the ancient world, this view of letter writing as being bad for someone's memory was shared by the Druids, and it gets recorded by Julius Caesar in his commentaries as he was fighting the Gallic Wars, etc. And you see here on the right, the Druids believed that their religion forbids them to commit their teachings to writing, although for most other purposes, such as public and private accounts, the Gauls will use the Greek alphabet. But I imagine that this rule was originally established for other reasons, because they did not want their doctrine to become public property, and in order to prevent their pupils from relying on the written word and neglecting to train their memories, where it is usually found that when people have the help of texts, they're less diligent in learning by heart and let their memories rust. Which is true. If we know that we have something written down in a textbook, we say, oh, well, I can always refer to that later, as opposed to if you were living in an oral culture, your memory is what you hear and what you think about and what you repeat. And that is the thing that will end up being more portable, because if you have that memory in your soul, now you can carry it with you wherever you go. So that's just as someone who has forgotten what he saw in the divine procession is only taken with physical beauty, but the lover who remembers his vision is both reminded externally and can recall internally, so writing will only be useful to those that possess that same dual aspect of memory we've just been discussing. And now we have an understanding of one of Plato's oft-used favorite topics, what we've just mentioned, amnesis, something that involves both external reminding and internal memory. And this leads to an understanding of why Socrates believes and privileges the oral word. Socrates then, still sitting in this sacred location that we've seen, where he has admitted the influence of the present gods upon him, he proceeds to describe what separates the oral from the literate, or rather what sets the spoken word above. And the word that is spoken, we will see, carries psyche. So let's look at this passage here. Phaedrus says, what kind of speech are you referring to, and how does it come into being? And Socrates says, the kind of speech that is written together with knowledge in the soul of the learner. So together with, combining with, and reminded again of how Socrates in the very beginning of this dialogue, he invokes the muses to take part with him, that there is a convergence of both the voice of the muses and his in this one speech. So the person that with knowledge has knowledge in the soul of the learner, so it's written together with knowledge of the soul of the learner, that is capable of defending itself and knowing how to speak and keep silent in relation to the people it should. So Phaedrus says, oh, you mean a living, animate speech of the man who knows, of which written speech would rightly be called a phantom. Now, this word living, animate speech you can see here in the Greek below is єμψυχον from psyche, which means soul, breath, spirit. So the ensouled word, the word that possesses soul, only that can be the living word. So the word that is spoken, as opposed to the word that is written, the word that is spoken, the winged word, that carries psyche, which is breath or spirit. So just as Socrates had invoked the muses to take part with him, so the speaker who aligns himself with divinity speaks words that carry spirit and soul. It is as if the words spoken by the mortal converge with divine inspiration to create a living word. And that living word is something Plato imitates, but we suppose that Socrates breathed. So in conclusion, the dialogue ends. We had this pair of speeches spoken by Socrates. We have the two present of the dialogue, Socrates and Phaedrus. So a pair of speeches, a pair of friends, the duel at its finest. We have both Lysias and a prophecy for Socrates that get passed throughout here. We have a prayer that it closes with, and they actually ask that Phaedrus says, let it make it a prayer for me too, for what friends have, they will share. So the dual nature of the word that we've seen already, the convergence of the mortal and the divine in the spoken word, the dual nature of the word will figure as we close into a dual prayer, as the two present in the dialogue share a word before continuing on. And then they'll finish by ending with the word ἴωμεν, which kind of brings us back to the opening, because in the beginning he said, where are you going? Where have you come from? And ἴωμεν is the plural, the two of us. Let's go. We're going onwards. We're converging together. We're no longer coming from separate directions. We're now going wherever we're going together. So the dual nature of the word figures into a dual prayer as the two present in the dialogue share a word before continuing on. The word has passed the barrier of the teeth, but it continues its course. The inquiry has begun, but it will always be continued. Thus, the opening directional lines are echoed here as to, like they're in soul words, proceed onward. And that is the end of the presentation. I will go ahead and stop my screen share.
Thank you so much, Lauren.
Almost came in on time. So close. So close.
It was a big topic.